Michael turned the key in the lock, and the old mechanism clicked with a familiar creak, as if welcoming his return. The door did not give in immediately, it always jammed after long rains, and in recent weeks autumn had been flooding the city with streams of cold water. He pushed it with his shoulder, and it finally opened, letting him into the dark hallway of his own house. His palms still tasted salty sweat mixed with road dust. Michael had spent the whole day on the road, carrying heavy boxes of spare parts to warehouses on the outskirts of the city. His back arched and his head was buzzing with fatigue, but the thought of home, of a hot dinner, and of Linda waiting for him with a familiar smile forced him to move forward. He crossed the threshold and froze, as if involuntarily listening to the silence. The house greeted him differently than usual. There was no soft light from the kitchen, no smell of freshly brewed coffee, no sound of Linda's footsteps, who always met him at the door, even if he was late. Michael frowned, trying to figure out what exactly had alerted him. The air in the house seemed heavy, almost tangible, as if someone had turned off the life in these walls and left only an echo. Only his old raincoat was hanging on the coat rack by the entrance. Linda's jacket, the same blue one with the frayed collar, was missing. "Linda," he called, his voice louder than he expected, bouncing off the empty hallway. There was no answer. Only somewhere in the back of the house, perhaps in the bedroom, he heard the faintest rustling sound, as if someone was carefully moving papers or brushing a curtain. Michael tensed, but quickly dismissed the suspicion. Perhaps Linda had simply dozed off, forgetting to turn off the radio, or perhaps she had gone out to the store and would be back soon. He kicked off his heavy boots, leaving dirty footprints on the floor, and walked into the kitchen, hoping to find some sign of her presence. There were a couple of cold cups of half-drunk tea on the table. Next to it was a plate with an unfinished dinner, a piece of chicken already covered in a thin film of fat, and a few slices of potato, as if Linda had cooked it in a hurry and forgotten to clear it away. Michael touched the edge of the plate. It was cold. His fingers froze, and something unpleasant stirred in his chest, like a premonition that had not yet taken shape as a thought. Linda had always been neat, even pedantic. She never left the dishes dirty, did not clear the table if she did not plan to return in a minute. It was not in her nature. He straightened up, looking around the kitchen. Everything was in its place. The faded floral curtains that Linda loved so much, neatly tied. Her favorite cactus, which she called Baby and watered with almost maternal care, on the windowsill. Magnets from their trips on the refrigerator, including the one with the words, "Together Forever," that they had bought on their first seaside trip together. But it all seemed somehow dead, as if the house had stopped breathing the moment Linda stepped out the door. Michael clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palms. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it only made his chest tighten. She just walked out, he told himself, but the voice in his head sounded unconvincing. He pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket and opened their text messages. Linda's last text had been from that morning. "Don't forget your umbrella, it's raining again today. Love." Michael had texted her, "Where are you? I'm home." His fingers were shaking, and he almost dropped the phone as he waited for a response. A minute passed. 2. The screen remained blank. He called again. "Linda." This time his voice wavered, betraying the anxiety he was trying to suppress. The silence that answered was almost deafening. But then, that rustling sound again. Now he was sure he had heard it. Not a random sound, but something alive, careful, as if someone were trying to move silently. Michael froze, listening. The sound was coming from the bedroom, and this time there was another sound added to the rustling, a muffled whisper, so quiet it could have been imagined. But Michael knew this house, knew its every creak and sigh. It was not the wind, not the old chimneys. It was a voice. His heart began to pound in his temples. He moved slowly down the hallway, trying to walk quietly, though the floorboards still creaked under his weight. He paused at the bedroom door, his hand on the handle. The door was ajar, just a few inches, but enough to let in a sliver of dim light. The lamp on the nightstand was on, though Linda usually turned it off when she left the room. Michael held his breath, trying to make out what was going on behind the door. The whispers grew a little louder, but the words were still inaudible. And then laughter. Short, muffled, but so familiar that Michael caught his breath. It was Linda's laughter. But it didn't have the lightness he was used to hearing when she joked about his clumsiness or teased him about his love of old westerns. This laughter was different, intimate, almost secret, as if it wasn't meant for him. Michael felt the blood rush to his face. His hand on the doorknob trembled, but he did not dare push the door. A swarm of thoughts swirled in his head, each one worse than the last. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe it was just Linda's friend who had dropped by, and they were chatting about something of their own. But friends do not whisper in the bedroom, do not laugh as if they were sharing a secret. And where was Linda then? Why did she not answer his calls, did not greet him as usual? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. It'll all become clear now, he told himself, but the voice in his head sounded foreign. He pushed the door, and it creaked open, letting him into the bedroom. The darkness of the room closed in on him, as if trying to hide what he was afraid to see. The light from the lamp was dim, but it was enough to make out shapes on the bed. Two people. Linda, her blonde hair, spread out across the pillow, unmistakable, and someone else. A man. His face was in shadow, but Michael could see his hand on Linda's shoulder, their bodies close, too close. Linda turned toward the door, and her eyes met Michael's. There was a flicker of panic in her gaze, mixed with something he couldn't quite place: guilt, shame, despair. "Michael," she breathed, her voice shaking as if she had just remembered he existed. She sat up with a jerk, pulling the blankets up over her as if they would protect her from his gaze. The man beside her stirred too, but said nothing. He only looked at Michael, and there was no fear or challenge in his eyes, only a cold calm that made Michael even angrier. "Linda," Michael said, his voice hoarse, as if someone was squeezing his throat. "What? What is this?" He stepped forward, clenching his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. A storm raged in his chest: anger, pain, disbelief. He wanted to scream, wanted to throw himself at this stranger, throw him out of their home, out of their life. But instead he stood transfixed, waiting for Linda to say something that would make everything right. That this was a mistake, that he had misunderstood, that this was not what it seemed. Linda was silent. Her lips trembled, but she could find no words. She just looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that for a moment Michael felt his own anger recede, giving way to something else: pity. Fear? He didn't know. "Who is he?" Michael asked, his voice rising to a scream. He hated himself for being so weak, for the way his voice was shaking, for standing here waiting for an answer instead of acting. "Linda, tell me who he is." She opened her mouth, but instead of words, only a soft sob came out. She lowered her head, and her hair fell over her face, hiding it from Michael. The man next to her finally spoke, and his voice was low, calm, almost mocking. "Maybe you should calm down, buddy." Michael turned to him, feeling his anger flaring up again. He stepped closer, and now the lamplight fell on the stranger's face. He was young, about 30, with dark hair and a light stubble. His eyes were cold, but there was a confidence in them, as if he knew he had a right to be here. Michael clenched his teeth, trying to contain himself. "Get out," he said, each word falling like a stone. "Get out of my house. Now." The man didn't move. He only tilted his head slightly, as if assessing Michael, and the corner of his mouth twitched into a half-smile. "Michael, please," Linda interjected, her voice full of desperation. She reached out her hand as if to stop him, but then pulled it back as if she'd been burned. "Don't. It's not his fault." "Not his fault?" Michael almost laughed, but it came out bitter, like the taste of blood in his mouth. "Whose fault is it then? Mine? Because I worked all day to put food on the table? Because I trusted you?" Linda winced as if struck. She looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was still silent. Michael waited for some kind of explanation, but the silence between them grew heavier and heavier until it became an abyss that could no longer be bridged. He turned to the man, who was still sitting on the bed, and took another step forward. "I said get out," he repeated, and this time his voice was as hard as steel. or I'll throw you out myself." The stranger sighed, as if Michael were nothing more than an annoying obstacle. He stood up slowly, straightening his shirt, and looked at Linda. "Are you sure you want me to leave?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made Michael cringe. Not a threat, not a taunt, something personal, as if there was something between him and Linda that Michael didn't know about. Linda didn't answer. She just looked away, clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. The man shrugged and walked toward the door, skirting Michael. As he passed, Michael caught a whiff of his cologne, pungent, expensive, not like the kind he bought at the supermarket. It was a small thing, but somehow it cut him harder than anything else. The door closed behind the stranger, and silence fell over the house again. Michael turned to Linda, but she still did not look at him. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. "Why?" he asked, and there was no anger in his voice anymore. Only pain, so deep it seemed to burn him from the inside. "Linda, just tell me why." She finally raised her head, and her eyes met his. There were so many tears in them that Michael momentarily forgot how to breathe. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. I I don't know, Michael." And in that moment, he realized that this was just the beginning of something that would change them both forever. Michael sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, parked on a deserted suburban boulevard, the streetlights casting long shadows across the wet asphalt. Night had fallen over the city, heavy and damp, like a blanket soaked in cold rain. The interior smelled of tobacco and the stale coffee he drunk that morning before heading out on other parts. Now the mug sat in the cup holder, cold and forgotten, like everything else in his life. Michael took a drag on his cigarette, feeling the bitter smoke scrape his throat, but even that pain couldn't stop the pain that was tearing him apart inside. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, his eyelids felt like lead, but every time he closed them, the same picture appeared before him. Linda, her blonde hair on the pillow, someone else's hand on her shoulder, and that look a mixture of guilt and panic, which he never thought to see in her eyes. He glanced at the phone on the passenger seat. The screen was blank, no messages, no missed calls. Linda hadn't tried to contact him, hadn't explained, hadn't apologized. The silence was the worst of it. It seemed to confirm that what he'd seen was real, and not a nightmare he could wake up from. Michael clenched his teeth, feeling his jaw ache with the tension. He wanted to scream, to punch the steering wheel, to smash something to release this storm, but instead he just sat there, staring out the window at the darkness, the occasional car passing by, leaving a trail of light in its wake. Finally, unable to stand the silence any longer, he grabbed the phone and dialed Dan's number. His fingers were shaking, and he missed the call button twice. The beeps continued endlessly until a sleepy, hoarse voice came from the other end. "Mike, what's wrong? I'm sleeping." "Dan, it's me." Michael's voice was low, almost alien. "I need your help. Please." There was a pause on the other end, then a rustling sound, as if Dan had sat up in bed, trying to shake off sleep. "What happened?" he asked, and there was no longer any irritation in his voice, only concern. "Where are you?" "On the boulevard, not far from your house." Michael swallowed, feeling the lump in his throat getting heavier. "Come." I don't know. Just come." Dan didn't ask any more questions. He'd known Michael long enough not to know that if Michael was calling in the middle of the night, it was serious. 20 minutes later, Dan's truck pulled up next to him, and soon Dan himself, in a wrinkled t-shirt and with his hair disheveled, was opening the passenger door of Michael's car. He was holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee briefly overpowered the stench of tobacco in the car. "Here." Dan handed one of the mugs to Michael and climbed into the seat. "You look like you got run over by a truck. What happened?" Michael took the mug, but didn't take a sip. He just stared at it, as if trying to find answers to the questions that were burning inside him in the black liquid. Street lights flickered outside, their light reflecting in puddles, and the few passers-by, wrapped in raincoats, hurried home. Michael felt disconnected from this world, as if he were stuck in some other dimension where everything he knew had collapsed in an instant. Linda cheated on me, he finally squeezed out, and each word was like a knife thrust. I came home and found her, with him, in our bedroom. Dan froze, his hand holding the mug halfway to his mouth. He turned slowly to Michael, his eyes flickering with something between shock and sympathy. "Oh my God," he whispered, lowering his mug. "Mike, are you serious?" Michael nodded, not looking at his friend. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt the words rushing out, and he couldn't stop them. "I've been driving all day, Dan, working my ass off to pay for this damn house, to make sure we had everything. And she's out there with some." He trailed off, unable to find the word. "Some bastard. On our bed." Dan was silent, letting Michael speak. He knew better than to interrupt. Michael took a drag on his cigarette, and the smoke swirled around the car, mixing with the steam from his coffee. "I didn't know what to expect after the war," Michael continued, his voice shaking, balancing on the edge of rage and despair. "I thought the worst was over. The nightmares, the explosions, the blood, I'd lived through it all. But this betrayal, I couldn't have imagined even in my worst nightmares." He fell silent, looking out the window. The war. It was always there, somewhere in the back of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Michael had come home 3 years ago, but sometimes he felt like he was still there, in the dusty trenches, where every sound could mean death. Linda had been his anchor, the thing that kept him in this world. She had greeted him with a smile when he woke from nightmares. She had listened to him when he talked about what he had seen, and she hadn't looked away even when he couldn't look her in the eye. And now that anchor was false. Dan placed his hand gently on Michael's shoulder. His touch was warm, but Michael still flinched as if he had been struck. "Mike," Dan said quietly, "you survived a war. You survived things most people can't even imagine. It's shit, I know, but you're stronger than this. You'll get through this." Michael shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. He hated himself for being so weak, for not being able to just get up and walk away, forget, start over. But the truth was, he didn't know how to live without Linda. She was part of his world, his home, his life. And now that world was crumbling, and he didn't know how to hold it together. "I want to go back," he said suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. "I want to go back into that bedroom and see it again. I want to understand why she did it. But I'm afraid, Dan, I'm afraid that if I go back, I won't be able to stop. That I—" He trailed off, not daring to finish. Dan frowned, his hand still on Michael's shoulder. "Don't, Mike," he said, and there was a firmness in his voice that Michael hadn't expected. "You don't have to kill her or him. It won't solve anything. You're stronger than this. Remember who you are." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the hum of the truck's engine lull him to sleep, Dan's words fading into silence. He wanted to believe his friend, wanted to believe that he really was stronger, that he could get through this without losing himself. But the storm was still raging inside him, and every gust brought new pain. He knew that there was a long, painful road ahead of him, full of shadows from the past, and that road scared him more than anything else. Outside, the night was growing thicker, the streetlights were fading, and the city outside the window seemed alien. Michael stubbed out his cigarette in an ashtray full of butts and took a sip of coffee. It was bitter, like his thoughts, but warm, and the warmth briefly drove the cold from his chest. Dan sat next to him, silently staring out the window, and his presence was the only thing keeping Michael from falling into the abyss. "Tell me everything," Dan said after a long pause. "From the beginning. Maybe if you talk it out, it will make it easier." Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure it would help. He began to speak, slowly, with difficulty choosing his words. He told of coming home, of the emptiness of the house, of the cups on the table, of the rustling outside the bedroom door. He talked about Linda, of the way her gaze had torn his heart apart, of the stranger whose impudence still burned inside him. With each word, he felt the heaviness in his chest lessen, but the pain didn't go away, it just changed shape, became sharper, deeper. Dan listened without interrupting, only occasionally nodding or taking a sip of coffee. By the time Michael finished, The night outside had grown even darker, and the truck was as quiet as fog. "What are you going to do?" Dan asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only a desire to understand. Michael shrugged. He didn't know. Go home, talk to Linda, or just drive away, leave everything behind, and never look back. Each option felt wrong, but he couldn't sit here in the car all night either. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I just don't know how to live on." Dan nodded as if he had expected this answer. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said. "Give yourself time. Sleep, think. Morning always brings clarity." Michael wanted to argue, to say that the morning wouldn't change anything, that the wound was too deep to heal overnight. But he didn't, because he knew Dan was right. Not that the morning would fix everything, but that he wasn't in a position to make decisions right now. His mind was clouded with anger and pain and fatigue, and any action he took now would be dictated by those emotions. "Stay at my place," Dan suggested. "I've got a couch, beer in the fridge. We can talk if you want, or just sleep." Michael shook his head. "Thank you, but I can't. Not now. I need—" He trailed off, unsure of how to finish. "I need to be alone." Dan looked at him for a long moment, but didn't argue. He simply nodded and opened the car door. "If you change your mind, call me," he said as he walked out. "And Mike, don't do anything stupid, okay?" Michael didn't answer. He watched Dan walk toward his truck, his figure fading into the darkness. As the headlights of his friend's car disappeared around the corner, Michael leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He felt the fatigue wash over him like a wave, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories swirled in his head, not just of tonight, but of the past. Of the first time he'd met Linda, how she'd laughed at his jokes, how they'd made plans on the porch of their small house. The memories were like salt in a wound, but he couldn't stop them. He pulled out another cigarette, but didn't light it. He just held it in his hands, looking at it as if it might hold answers. The night dragged on endlessly, and Michael knew it wouldn't end until he found the strength to move on. But now all he could do was sit, listen to the hum of the engine, and try to figure out how to live in a world where everything he thought was his was a lie. A razor-thin ray of sunlight filtered through a crack in the curtains and slashed across the bedroom floor, illuminating the dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. Michael stood in the hallway, leaning his shoulder against the door frame, watching the light creep slowly across the faded carpet. He hadn't slept all night, not a minute, not a second. After talking to Dan, he had returned home in the early morning, when the sky had already begun to turn gray and the city was still dozing in the pre-dawn silence. He didn't go into the bedroom, didn't lie down on the couch, didn't even turn on the light. He simply stood there in the hallway, listening to the house breathe its emptiness, and waited. For what? He didn't know himself. Maybe for Linda to wake up. Maybe for some sign that all of this was a mistake, a mirage that would dissipate with the first ray of sunlight. But there was no sign, and now he could hear Linda fussing about in the bathroom, hastily blow-drying her hair, as if nothing had happened, as if last night hadn't torn their lives apart. The sound of the hairdryer stopped, and Michael tensed as he heard her footsteps. She walked down the hallway, not noticing him in the dim light, and headed for the front door. Her movements were quick, almost fussy, as if she were in a hurry to escape this house, him, herself. Michael clutched her wedding ring, which he had found on the nightstand when he returned. It was cold, like metal that had lain outside all night, and it felt foreign, as if it belonged to a different Linda than the one he knew. He stepped forward, and his voice, hoarse from lack of sleep and pain, broke the silence. "Linda!" She froze, her hand already on the doorknob. She turned slowly, and her eyes, wide open, met his. She was wearing a bright robe, the same one she liked to wear in the mornings when she was making breakfast and humming something under her breath. But now it looked ridiculous, like a costume from someone else's life. Her face was pale, there were shadows under her eyes, and her lips were trembling, as if she didn't know what to say. "Michael?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You? Where have you been all night?" He was silent, feeling the silence between them grow thick, almost tangible. Linda's question hung in the air, and there was something in it that angered Michael more than he expected. Where was? As if he was the one who had to justify himself. As if he was the one who had destroyed everything they had. He took a step forward, still clutching the ring in his fist, and his voice, when he spoke, was dry as scorched earth. "I'm gone." He paused, looking into her eyes. "Linda, we're done. I've filed for divorce." Her face twitched, as if he had struck her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she was not crying, not yet. She just looked at him, and there was so much guilt, so much fear in her eyes that for a moment Michael felt his resolve crack. But then he remembered last night, her hair on the pillow, someone else's hand on her shoulder, her panicked gaze, and the crack healed, leaving only a cold, heavy emptiness. "Mike, please." Her voice trembled like a thin string ready to snap. "I'll fix this. It was a mistake. Please give me a chance." Michael shook his head, taking a step back. His fingers relaxed, and the ring fell to the floor with a soft clink that seemed deafening in the silence. "A mistake?" he asked again, and there was no anger in his voice, only an icy calm that frightened even himself. "You call this a mistake?" Linda winced, her hands clutching the edges of her robe. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Michael waited, even though he knew that no words could change anything. He remembered Dan's words in the car that night. "You're stronger, Mike. You don't have to kill her or him." Those words were like an anchor, keeping him from breaking down, from giving in to the rage that still simmered deep inside him. But he didn't feel rage now. Only pain, so deep it seemed to be burning him from the inside. "I love you," Linda said suddenly, her voice breaking on the last word. She stepped toward him, holding out her hand as if she could hold him, take it all back. "Michael, I love you. I swear it was. It meant nothing. Please believe me." He flinched back as her fingers almost touched his arm. His gaze was cold as steel, and he spoke, enunciating each word. "Don't touch me." Linda froze, her hand hanging in the air. The tears had finally broken through, streaming down her cheeks, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. She simply stood there, looking at him, and there was so much despair in her eyes that for a moment Michael felt guilty. But the feeling was gone, replaced by the memory of how she had looked at that man, how her body had been pressed against his, how she had remained silent when he demanded an answer. He turned to the two bags by the door. They were her things, packed the night before while she slept, unable to stand being in the same room with her. He didn't look at what he was putting away, clothes, makeup, some knickknacks from her nightstand. He didn't care. He just wanted her presence out of this house, out of his life. "Take your things," he said, pointing to the bags, "and don't ever call me again." Linda looked at the bags, then at him, her face twisting as if she were just realizing that these weren't just words, not a flash of anger that could be waited out. This was the end. She took a step toward the bags, then stopped, her hands shaking, her forehead glistening with sweat despite the cool morning air. "Michael," her voice was barely audible, "please listen to me. I didn't mean for it to end this way. I... I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't mean to hurt you." He turned to her, and his gaze was so heavy that she involuntarily retreated. "You didn't mean to?" His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Do you think it matters? Do you think I should stand here and listen to you make excuses? After what I saw? After the way you stayed silent when I asked who he was?" Linda swallowed, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her robe. "I didn't know what to say," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I was shocked. I didn't expect you to come back so early. I panicked." Michael almost laughed, but the laugh came out bitter, like the taste of blood in his mouth. "Panicked?" he asked. "You panicked because I caught you with him. What if I hadn't come back? What then? Would you have continued to lie to me? Pretend everything was okay?" She lowered her head, and her hair fell over her face, hiding it from him. "I wasn't lying," she said quietly. I just didn't know how to tell you." "Say what?" His voice broke into a scream, and he immediately regretted it. He didn't want to scream, didn't want to let her see how much she had hurt him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. That you don't want to be with me anymore? That you don't need me? That you found someone better? Linda shook her head, her tears dripping onto the floor, leaving dark stains on the carpet. No, she whispered. It's not like that. I need you, Michael. I've always needed you. It was, it was a moment of weakness. A moment when I lost control. I don't know why it happened, but I swear it doesn't mean I don't love you. He looked at her, and two feelings fought in his chest. The desire to believe her and the desire to leave without looking back. He wanted to believe that it really was a mistake, that she was still the Linda who had waited for him after the war, who had held his hand when he woke up from nightmares. But every time he looked at her, he saw not her, but that scene in the bedroom, and this memory was like a knife stabbed into his heart. You don't understand, he said finally, and his voice was calm, almost dead. This isn't just a mistake, Linda. This is betrayal. You ruined everything we had. And I can't. I can't look at you and not see highs. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, and Michael felt his own resolve cracking again. He hated himself for it, for still loving her despite everything. But love doesn't disappear overnight, even if it's mixed with pain and anger. What should I do? She asked, raising her head. Her eyes were red, but there was a sincere plea in them. Tell me what I can do to make you forgive me. I'll do anything, Michael. I'll leave if you want me to, or I'll stay if you give me a chance. Just tell me. He looked at her, his mind racing. He could tell her to stay. He could try to forgive her, to start over. But he knew it was impossible. Every time he looked at her, he would see that man. Every time she touched him, he would wonder if she had touched him like that. His thigh's wound was too deep to heal. Nothing, he said finally. There's nothing you can do. It's all over. Linda froze, her face a mask of pain and disbelief. She nodded slowly, as if accepting his words, but her movements were mechanical, like a puppet whose strings had snapped. She walked over to the bags, took them by the handles, but stopped, turning to face him. I never wanted it to end this way, she said, her voice barely audible. I know you don't believe me, but I loved you, and I always will. Michael didn't answer. He just watched her open the door and step outside. The morning light blinded him, and he squinted, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. Linda stood on the porch, her figure small and fragile against the bright sun. She turned, and their eyes met for a moment. There was so much pain in her eyes that Michael couldn't help but look away. He heard her coming down the steps, the bags crunching on the gravel. He waited until the sound of her footsteps faded, until it was clear she was gone. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, and that exhalation was like the final chord that closed their story. Michael closed the door and leaned his back against it. The house was empty as ever. He walked into the living room, where their photographs were still on the shelf. Their wedding, their trip to the seaside, their first New Year together. He picked up one of the frames, the one of Linda laughing and hugging him on the beach, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he put it back, face down. He stepped outside, feeling the morning light burn his eyes. A chill ran down his spine, but it was not the chill of fear, but the chill of determination. Everything that was supposed to happen had already happened. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove out onto the road without looking back. One thought was spinning in his head. The day of separation had come, and now he had to learn to live again. Michael lived his last days as if in a half-sleep, where reality and memories merged into one murky, viscous mass. He got up in the morning, dressed mechanically, went to the warehouse, where he dragged boxes of spare parts, talked with colleagues, but all this was like scenery in someone else's play. His thoughts invariably returned to one thing, to Linda, to her eyes full of tears, to that man whose silhouette now haunted him even in his dreams. At night, when he finally fell asleep for a couple of hours, he dreamed of fragments. Her hair on the pillow, someone else's hand sliding along her shoulder, and silence that was louder than any scream. He woke up in a cold sweat, clenching his fists, but instead of giving free rein to anger, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling until the first rays of light began to break through the curtains. One evening, a few days after Linda left, Michael met Dan again. They were sitting in the corner of an old bar on the outskirts of town that smelled of spilled beer and cheap laundry detergent. The bar was nearly empty. A bartender lazily polished glasses behind the counter, and a couple of truckers in the corner were discussing something, laughing hoarsely. Dan ordered 2 beers, but Michael barely touched him. He swirled the mug in his hands, watching the foam settle, trying to figure out what to do next. Across from him, Dan looked at him with the same wary concern that had been in his eyes that night in the car. "How are you?" Dan asked, leaning back in his chair. His voice was soft, but there was an urgency to it, as if he knew Michael wouldn't answer honestly but wanted to try anyway. Michael shrugged without looking up. "I'm alive," he said briefly, and there was no emotion or desire to continue the conversation in his voice. Dan frowned, placed his mug on the table, and leaned a little closer. "Mike, that's not an answer," he said. "You look like you've been through a meat grinder. What's going on in your head? What's next?" Michael finally looked up, a mixture of weariness and irritation flashing in his eyes. "What am I supposed to do, Dan?" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Go home, pretend nothing happened, forgive her, or maybe find that bastard and smash his face in." Dan shook his head, but didn't look away. "I'm not saying you have to pretend, but you can't just exist. You have to do something." He paused, as if weighing his words, and then added more quietly, "I might be able to find out something about him." Michael froze, his fingers tightening around his mug. The thought of finding out who the man was both terrified and tempted him. He was afraid to dig deeper, afraid of what he might find, but at the same time, the unknown was a thorn in his side. He remembered Dan's words from that night, "You don't have to kill her or him." Those words had kept him from his blind rage, but now they sounded different, like a challenge. If he couldn't understand why Linda had done what she had done, if he couldn't find out who this man was, he would be weak, broken, unable to move on. "Are you serious?" Michael asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Can you do this?" Dan nodded, his face serious. "I have a couple of friends who can do some digging. Nothing serious, just find out who he is, where he works, what kind of person he is, if you want." Michael was silent, staring at the table. His heart was beating faster, and he felt a hum growing in his chest, not anger, but something deeper, almost primal. He wanted to know. Know Hempstead to know. Not to take revenge, but to understand how his life, which seemed so solid, collapsed in an instant. "Okay," he said finally, his voice as firm as a hammer blow. "Find out what you can. But," he hesitated, searching for the words, "I don't want this to go too far. Just information." Dan nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "Agreed. I'll do it tomorrow. And you, at least try to get some sleep, Mike. You look like a ghost." Michael didn't answer. He took a sip of beer, but it tasted as bland as water. They sat there for a while, exchanging occasional words, but the conversation didn't go well. Dan left first, clapping Michael on the shoulder and reminding him to call if anything happened. Michael was left alone, staring at his empty mug, feeling the silence of the bar pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. When he got home, he couldn't sit still. The house felt strange. Every corner, everything reminded him of Linda. Her scent still lingered in the air, even though he had thrown out her clothes and makeup. On the couch in the living room lay her old sweater, which he hadn't noticed when he had packed up her things. Michael picked it up, intending to throw it away, but instead he froze, clutching the soft fabric in his hands. He remembered Linda wearing that sweater in the evenings, curling up and reading her novels while he watched old westerns. The memory hit him like a blow, and he threw the sweater to the floor as if it had burned his hands. Looking for some distraction, he began rummaging through drawers, closets, anywhere she might have left her things. He didn't know what he was looking for, maybe a note, maybe something that would explain why she had done what she had done. In one of the drawers, he found her old notebook, the one she used for shopping lists and random notes. He opened it, hoping to find something, but there were only meaningless notes. Buy milk, call mom, pick up a coat from dry cleaning. On the last page, however, was a short sentence written in her neat handwriting. Call A at 6 p.m. Michael frowned. Who was A? He turned the page, but there was nothing else. The discovery lit a spark in him. He didn't know if it had anything to do with the man, but it was something he could latch on to. He sat on the couch, flipping through the notebook over and over, but found nothing else. Then he remembered her laptop, which he had left in the bedroom. Linda had left in a hurry, taking only the bags he had packed, and apparently hadn't thought about technology. Michael found the laptop on the nightstand, turned it on, and was surprised to find that it was not password protected. Linda had never been careful with such things. She trusted him, and the thought cut him like a knife. He opened her email, feeling guilty, but quickly shook it off. If she could betray him, he had a right to know the truth. There were a few emails from colleagues in his inbox, a couple of marketing emails, nothing out of the ordinary. But in his sent folder, he found an email dated a week ago, sent to an address he didn't recognize. The subject was blank, and the body was short. Meet me Friday, 7 p.m., as usual. There was no signature, but the reply he found in the chain read, Yes, I'll be there. A. Michael felt the blood rush to his face. A. Again, this couldn't be a coincidence. He copied the email address and closed the laptop, his heart pounding. It was a lead, however tenuous. He didn't know what to do next, but the thought of finding this person, finding out who they were, why they were in their lives, was nagging at him. He put on his jacket, grabbed his keys, and walked out of the house, not really thinking about where he was going. The car, as luck would have it, didn't start. The battery must have been dead from the night he'd left the headlights on. Michael cursed, kicking the tire, and looked around. In the yard was the motorcycle of his neighbor, Bill, another veteran with whom he occasionally exchanged a few words. Bill was away, but Michael knew where he kept the keys in a tin can under the porch. He took them, feeling a slight twinge of guilt, but quickly shrugged it off. Bill would understand. After all, they both knew what it was like to search for answers when the world was falling apart. Michael mounted his bike, put on his helmet, and started the engine. The roar of the engine was deafening, and the sound, raw and alive, briefly drowned out the chaos in his head. He pulled out onto the highway out of town and stepped on the gas, feeling the wind whipping his face and the rain that had suddenly started hitting his helmet. The road was almost empty, only the occasional headlight from an oncoming car flickering in the darkness. Michael didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. He needed movement, needed something to take his mind off his pain, his sense of drowning in his own life. The rain was falling harder, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the city lights. Michael rode faster, pushing the bike to its limits. The wind howled in his ears, mixing with the roar of the engine, and in the noise he felt a strange calm. He was no longer Michael, the husband, the veteran, the man who had been betrayed. He was just a shadow moving across the highway, a ghost searching for something that might not exist. But the longer he drove, the clearer it became that running wouldn't help. Thoughts of Linda, of that man, of the letter signed A, kept coming back like waves washing onto the shore. He remembered her voice when she'd begged him to forgive him, her tears, her trembling hands. And he remembered that man, his cold gaze, his certainty, as if he had a right to be there, in their home, in their lives. The thought ignited a spark of anger in him, but it was followed by another, more bitter one. He didn't want to be the kind of man who lived for revenge. He didn't want this to end in bloodshed or blind rage. He wanted to understand, and maybe let go. At dawn, as the sky began to lighten and the rain slowed to a drizzle, Michael pulled to the side of the road. He removed his helmet, feeling the cold drops trickle down his face, and looked out at the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. He was exhausted, but there was something cleansing about that fatigue. He realized that he would not seek out this man to punish him. He would seek him to understand, to close this chapter and move on. Not as a hero, not as an avenger, but simply as a man trying to put himself back together. He returned home as the sun was rising over the city. He left Bill's motorcycle where it was, putting the keys back in the jar. The house greeted him with silence, but now it didn't seem so oppressive. Michael sat down on the couch, looking at Linda's sweater still lying on the floor, and felt ready to begin. Not to take revenge, not to destroy, but to look for answers, and maybe to find himself. The rain was pouring down, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the dim lights of the street lamps and the occasional headlights of passing cars. Michael drove through the night city, gripping the steering wheel of his old pickup as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into the abyss. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, but the cold did not touch him. A fire burned inside, not anger, but something deeper, colder and sharper, like the blade of a knife. In the pocket of his jacket was a piece of paper torn from Linda's notebook with an address carefully written. Steve, 17 Elm Street, Apt. 3. The words, written in her hand, were like poison, slowly poisoning his thoughts. He didn't know what he would do when he got there, but he knew he had to. Not for revenge, not for a fight, but to look into the eyes of the man who stole everything from him, and maybe understand why his life collapsed in an instant. The last few days had been a strange blur. Michael would wake up in the morning, drink bitter coffee, drive to the warehouse to haul heavy boxes of parts, but it was all a dream. His mind was somewhere else in the bedroom where he'd found Linda with another man, in her eyes full of guilt and fear, in her pleas he didn't want to hear. He'd barely slept at night, and when he did, it was in nightmares. Her hair on the pillow, a hand sliding down her shoulder, a silence that was louder than any scream. But now, with the address in his pocket, he felt something new building inside him, not rage, but a cold, almost surgical determination. He remembered Dan's words in the car that night. "You're stronger. You don't have to kill her or him." And he wasn't going to. He wanted the truth. He wanted those who betrayed him to know that he knew. Michael parked on the corner of Elm Street and turned off the engine. The rain pounded the roof of the car, creating a rhythm that was soothing but did not dispel the tension. Number 17 was an old 3-story building with peeling paint and rusty mailboxes out front. Only a few windows were lit, and one of them, on the second floor, must be Steve's apartment. Michael sat in the car, looking out that window, and felt his heart beat faster. He pulled out a photograph from his dresser drawer, the one he had found with his notebook. It was old, the edges yellowed, but the faces were clear. Linda, smiling, her hair blown about by the wind, and the man next to her, his arm around her waist. It was him, Steve. Michael didn't know where or when the photograph had been taken, but it burned his fingers like a hot coal. He squeezed it in his fist, feeling the paper crumple, and got out of the car. The rain lashed his face, soaking his jacket, but Michael didn't raise his hood. He walked up the creaky steps to the entrance, found the intercom button with the number 3 and pressed it. Silence. He pressed it again, harder, and after a few seconds a woman's voice rang out, tired and slightly irritated. "Who's there?" Michael swallowed, trying to collect himself. "I need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's important." A pause. Then the intercom clicked and the door opened. Michael entered the entrance, which smelled of dampness and old paint, and went up to the second floor. The apartment door was slightly open, and in the doorway stood a woman of about 40, with a tired look and her hair pulled back carelessly. She was wearing a shabby housecoat and holding a kitchen towel in her hands, as if he had caught her in the middle of cleaning. "Who are you?" she asked, her eyes searching for Michael. There was wariness in her voice, but no hostility. Michael took a step forward, feeling the floorboards creak under his weight. "Are you Steve's wife?" he asked directly, looking her in the eyes. The woman frowned, her fingers tightening on the towel. "Yes," she answered after a short pause. "I'm Emma, and you, who are you?" Michael slowly pulled the photograph out of his pocket and handed it to her. His hand was shaking, but he tried to keep his composure. "That's all you need to know," he said, his voice bitter as the taste of ash. "Your husband is with my wife." Emma picked up the photograph, her movements slow, almost mechanical. She looked at it, and her face went pale. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. She leaned against the door frame as if her legs refused to support her, and her fingers gripped the photograph so tightly that the paper cracked. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This can't be true." Michael looked at her, and two feelings fought in his chest: pity and cold satisfaction. He didn't want to hurt her, but at the same time he felt that she needed to know. She had a right to the truth, just as he did. "I saw them," he said, his voice flat, almost emotionless. "In our bedroom. I came home earlier than she expected, and—" he trailed off, unable to continue. The image of that night came back to him, and he clenched his fists to push it away. Emma looked up, and there was so much pain in her eyes that Michael couldn't help but look away. "How long?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How long has this been going on?" Michael shrugged, feeling fatigue wash over him like a wave. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Maybe weeks. Maybe months. I found this photo and the address in her things. That's all I have." Emma nodded, her movement slow, as if she were trying to process each word. She looked at the photograph again, then carefully placed it on the hall table, as if it were a bomb about to explode. "Steve, he's late a lot," she said, her voice hollow, as if she were talking to herself rather than Michael. "He says they're in a rush at work, that projects are urgent. I never checked. I trusted him." Michael was silent, not knowing what to say. He had not expected this woman, Emma, to be so ordinary, tired but kind, with wrinkles around her eyes that spoke of years of care and compromise. He suddenly realized that she, like him, had fallen victim to this lie, and this discovery did not bring him relief, but only increased the pain. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and his voice was sincere. "I didn't mean to. I just thought you should know." Emma looked at him, and gratitude mixed with despair flashed in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what to do next, but thank you." Michael nodded, turning to leave, when footsteps came from the back of the apartment. The door to the living room opened, and a man walked into the hallway, the one from the photograph. Steve. He was wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, holding a mug of coffee, and his face froze for a moment when he saw Michael. Then he frowned, looking at Emma. Who is it?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. Emma turned to him, her face twisted in pain. She picked up the photograph from the table and held it out to him, her hand shaking. "This, Steve," she said, her voice unexpectedly firm. "This is what you did behind my back." Steve picked up the photograph, his eyes running over it, and Michael saw his face change. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. He looked at Michael, and recognition flickered in his eyes. "You," he began, but Michael interrupted him. "I'm the one whose wife you had sex with in my house," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I'm the one who caught you in my bedroom, and now I'm here to make sure your wife knows the truth, too." Steve swallowed, his fingers tightening around the mug so tightly it almost cracked. He looked at Emma, then back at Michael, panic flickering in his eyes. It's not what you think," he began, but Emma cut him off. "Don't lie," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Don't you dare lie to me, Steve. I'm tired of your excuses. How long? How long have you been doing this?" Steve opened his mouth, but found no words. He just stood there, looking at the photograph, his face a mask of shame and despair. Michael looked at him, and there was no triumph in his chest, only emptiness. This man he hated was not a monster, just weak, caught in a lie. "I don't want to hear your excuses," Michael said to Steve. "That's not why I came. I came so you know what I know." And so she, he nodded at Emma, knew too. Emma sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Steve took a step toward her, but she recoiled. "Don't come near me," she said, her voice full of pain. "Just go away. I need to think." Steve looked at her, then at Michael, and his shoulders slumped. He set his mug down on the table and walked out of the hallway without saying a word. The bedroom door closed behind him with a soft click, and the apartment fell silent. Michael looked at Emma, unsure of what to say. "I have to go," he said finally. "I'm sorry that everything is like this." Emma nodded without looking up. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. I'll figure it out." Michael stepped outside, feeling the rain hit his face again. He got into his car, but didn't start the engine. He just sat there, looking at the wet windshield, trying to figure out what he was feeling. Relief? No, not exactly. Satisfaction? No, also no. It was a strange mixture of tiredness and emptiness, as if he'd done a duty but gotten nothing out of it except more pain. When he got home, he found his mailbox full of letters. Among the bills and advertisements were 2 envelopes with no return address. He had written them that morning before he went to Emma's. One was addressed to Linda, the other to Steve. There were no threats or curses inside, just a short message: "I know who you are and what you've done. Now live with it." Michael didn't know if they would read the letters, but it didn't matter. He had done what he had to do. He had shown them that the truth would not remain in the shadows. He walked into the house, threw his keys on the table, and sat down on the sofa. The silence was deafening, but it didn't frighten him now. He felt that this chapter of his life was closed. Not heroically, not triumphantly, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible victory. He hadn't ruined their lives, he had simply shown them a mirror. And now he had to learn to live on, step by step, day by day. Several weeks had passed since that rainy evening when Michael had stood in a strange hallway, holding a photograph that had torn apart not only his life, but the life of Emma, Steve's wife. The days had passed slowly, like thick syrup, each one similar to the last, but in the monotony Michael found a strange comfort. He would rise in the morning, drink bitter coffee brewed in an old saisve, drive to the warehouse where he lugged heavy boxes of spare parts, and return home as the sun was setting. The work was mechanical, but it gave him structure, a framework within which he could exist without thinking too much about the past. But at night, when the silence of the house became deafening, his psyche was tested. The nightmares returned with stubborn regularity. Linda, her tears, her pleas, and that man, Steve, whose face was now burned into his memory. Michael would wake up in a cold sweat, clenching his fists, but instead of giving in to his anger, he would simply lie there, staring at the ceiling until the first rays of light began to break through the curtains. He learned to live again, step by step, like a soldier learning to walk again after a war. It wasn't easy, but he felt that with each passing day, the wound in his chest was becoming a little less acute. He no longer looked for answers in Linda's old things, didn't leaf through her notebook, didn't open her laptop. He sent letters, 2 short messages with no return address, one to Linda, one to Steve, with the same text: "I know who you are and what you did. Now live with it." It was his last word in their story, and he felt that with this burden, it became easier to breathe. But the past did not let go completely. It lurked somewhere on the edge of consciousness, like a shadow, ready to slip out at any moment. One Friday night, Michael found himself back in the bar on the outskirts of town where he and Dan had met many times. The bar was old, with worn wooden tables and dim light that barely filtered through dusty ceilings. It smelled of spilled beer and fried potatoes, and something vaguely cozy, like places where people gather to forget their troubles. The bartender, an older man with gray sideburns, was lazily cleaning glasses behind the bar, and in the corner, a couple of truckers were playing pool, their laughter echoing through the room, drowning out an old rock ballad playing on the jukebox. Michael and Dan sat by the window, watching the street lights reflect off the puddles on the wet pavement. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp, and the windows of the bar were fogged up from the heat inside. Michael picked at the sushi they had ordered instead of their usual beer, Dan insisting that they should try something new at least once. The sushi was unusual, a little salty, but Michael ate it mechanically, not really thinking about the taste. His mind was elsewhere, in the emptiness left by Linda's departure. Dan, sitting across from him, looked at him with the same cautious concern that had been in his eyes that night in the car. "What do we do now, Dan?" Michael asked, putting his chopsticks down and looking out the window. His voice was quiet, but there was weariness in it, mixed with something new uncertainty, but not weakness. "I did everything I could. I told the truth, I closed that door. But what now?" Dan shrugged, taking a sip of beer from his mug. His face was serious, but there was a slight smile at the corners of his lips, as if he knew Michael was already halfway to something new but couldn't see it yet. "You did it, Mike," he said, setting his mug down. "You didn't lose your temper, you didn't retaliate, you didn't let it break you. That's a win. Now," he paused, choosing his words, "now just live, one day at a time. Find something to keep you afloat. Maybe a new job, maybe a hobby. Hell, maybe even a woman when you're ready." Michael chuckled, shaking his head. The idea of a new woman seemed so far away, almost absurd. He could still feel Linda in every corner of his life, her scent, her laughter, her habit of leaving her tea half drunk on the table. But he didn't argue with Dan. He knew his friend was right, at least partly. Life hadn't stopped, even if he thought it should. They sat there for a while, exchanging the odd conversation about work, the weather, Dan's plans to take a vacation and go fishing. The conversation was light, but underneath it was a depth of friendship that didn't need words. When the clock on the bar's wall showed almost midnight, they decided it was time to go. Michael paid for the sushi, Dan for the beer, and they walked out into the street, where the wet asphalt glistened under the yellow light of the street lamps. The air was cold but crisp, and Michael took a deep breath, feeling his lungs fill with moisture. He was about to say goodbye to Dan and head for his truck when he spotted a figure walking down the sidewalk. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his hair wild in the wind. Michael didn't recognize him at first, but when the light from the street lamp fell on his face, his heart skipped a beat. It was Steve. Steve spotted Michael first. His eyes widened, and he paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to run or stay. Then his face twisted in anger, and he stepped forward, clenching his fists. His voice, hoarse and trembling, broke the silence of the street. "You," he shouted, pointing at Michael. "You ruined everything. You told her the truth, didn't you? Now I've lost everything." Michael stood still, feeling the blood rush to his face, but not letting his anger get the better of him. He looked at Steve, and there was no fear or anger in his eyes, only a cool, almost emotionless calm. Dan, standing next to him, tensed, ready to intervene, but Michael raised his hand slightly, indicating that he could handle it himself. "Yes, that's true," he said, his voice as smooth as the surface of a lake. "I told her the truth, because she deserved to know. And you made that choice, Steve, not me." Steve growled, his face red with anger. He lunged at Michael, his hand lashing out at his face, but Michael was faster. The war had taught him to react instantly, without thinking. He grabbed Steve's wrist, twisting it sharply, and shoved the man against the wall of the nearest building. There was a dull thud as Steve's back hit a brick, and the glass he had been holding clearly fresh from the bar crashed onto the pavement, shattering into pieces. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot, and for a moment everything was still. "Oh, you," Steve hissed, trying to break free, but Michael held him tightly, pressing him against the wall. His face was close, and panic flashed in Steve's eyes. "That's enough," Michael said, his voice low, almost growling. "I'm not going to fight again. Not with you. You're not worth it." He felt the memories of the war, the dust, the screams, the smell of blood rising from the depths of his mind, but he pushed them away. He was not a man to shoot without thinking. He was stronger. He remembered Dan's words, "No killing," and he wasn't going to. But that didn't mean he was going to let Steve hit him. Steve jerked, trying to strike with his free hand, but Michael was ready. He twisted his arm harder, and Steve cried out, his face twisting in pain. Michael didn't mean to break bones, but the pressure was hard enough to let him know he was serious. "Let go," Steve croaked, his voice shaking. You attacked me. I'll call the cops." Michael chuckled, his lips twisting into a bitter smile. "Attacked?" he asked. "You were the first to rush. And I have a witness." He nodded toward Dan, who was standing a few steps away, watching the scene with a tense face. A woman, one of the waitresses, came out of the bar door, holding a phone. Her eyes were wide open, and she clearly didn't expect to see a fight right outside the door. "I'm calling the police," she screamed, her voice shaking. "Stop it." Michael slowly released Steve, taking a step back. His heart was beating steadily, as if he had just finished a workout rather than holding himself back from punching the man who had ruined his life in the face. He looked at Steve, who was still holding onto the wall, cradling his dislocated arm, and said quietly but firmly, "If you need an extract, go to the police. But remember, the truth is on my side." Steve looked at him, his face a mixture of anger and fear. You'll pay for this," he muttered, but his voice was unconvincing. He took a step back, nearly tripping over the broken glass, and headed toward his car, parked across the street. Blue lights appeared in the distance, and soon a police cruiser pulled up outside the bar. Two officers got out of their car, their faces tired but professionally alert. The waitress immediately ran up to them, explaining something and pointing at Michael and Steve. Dan stepped forward, ready to speak, but Michael stopped him with a look. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly. One of the officers, a man of about 50 with gray hair at his temples, approached Michael. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice even, but with the weariness of a man who had seen too many such scenes. Michael told the whole story, not holding back any details. He spoke calmly, looking the officer in the eye, about how Steve had attacked him, how he had defended himself, how it had all started with his accusations. Dan corroborated his words, adding that Steve had been the first to throw punches. Steve, standing by his car, tried to argue, claiming that Michael had attacked him for no reason, but his version sounded confused, and the dislocated arm and the shards of glass on the pavement spoke for themselves. The officers looked at each other, and the second, younger one, wrote down the testimony in a notebook. "We'll sort it out," said the senior officer. "But that's enough for today. If there are complaints, you'll be called. Now go home." Steve, still holding his hand, got into his car and drove away without another word. Michael watched him go, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body. The police drove away after him, and the waitress returned to the bar, casting a wary glance at Michael and Dan. Dan clapped Michael on the shoulder, his face a mixture of relief and admiration. "Damn, Mike, you were a rock," he said, shaking his head. "I thought you were going to break his jaw, but you held your own." Michael shrugged, feeling fatigue wash over him like a wave. "I didn't want to fight," he said quietly. "I just wanted him to know he couldn't just come and threaten me." They returned to Michael's truck, and Dan insisted that he go home with him rather than stay alone. Michael didn't argue. He was too exhausted to object. Dan's house smelled of coffee and old books, and Michael, sitting on the couch with a mug in his hands, finally allowed himself to relax. They talked until the early hours of the morning about life, about the past, about what lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt ready to take the next step without looking back. The morning after that night at the bar greeted Michael with cold light filtering through the cracks in the curtains. He woke up on Dan's couch, his back aching and his ears ringing slightly, as if he could still hear the roar of his truck or Steve's scream as he crashed into the wall. His body ached, as if he'd been on a long march in full gear, but inside he was quiet, not empty, but calm like the sea after a storm. For the first time in months, he wasn't waking up from a nightmare, choking on memories of Linda or that bedroom where his life had split into before and after. He just lay there, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of someone else's house, and felt something inside him changing, slowly but surely. Dan, already busy in the kitchen, noticed his awakening and placed a mug of coffee in front of him, black as tar and hot as asphalt in July. "You look like you were run over by a tank," he said, sitting down across from her with his own mug. "But your eyes are alive. That's a good sign." Michael chuckled, wrapping both hands around the mug. The warmth burned his palms, but he didn't let go, as if that warmth could drive away the last of the night's fatigue. "I'm fine," he said, and to his surprise, he realized it was true. "Yesterday, I thought it would end worse, but I held on." Dan nodded, his gaze serious, but a smile flickered at the corners of his lips. "You didn't just hold on, Mike. You showed that bastard that he couldn't just come and threaten you, and you didn't break his neck. That's almost a feat, you know." Michael shook his head, taking a sip of coffee. The bitter taste spread across his tongue, and he suddenly remembered how Linda always winced when she tasted his coffee and added 3 spoons of sugar to her own. The memory didn't cut through him like it had before, but simply passed through him like the shadow of a cloud and dissolved. "I called the police," he said, looking at Dan. "Myself, I didn't want this to turn into." He hesitated, searching for the word, "a war." Dan raised his eyebrows but didn't comment. He simply nodded, and the gesture conveyed everything Michael needed to hear: respect, support, faith that he had made the right choice. Michael had a hard time getting to work. His legs felt like lead and his back ached with every step, but he hadn't taken the day off. The warehouse was his anchor, a place where he could turn off his brain and just move, hauling boxes, checking delivery notes, chatting with coworkers. But today, even the routine felt different. He noticed little things he'd never noticed before: the way sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of the hangar, the smell of engine oil and freshly cut wood, the way one of the movers, a guy named Tony, hummed an old song under his breath as he sorted through parts. These details were alive, real, and they made him feel, oddly enough, like a part of the world, not like a ghost wandering through its wreckage. In the office hallway where the coffee and old file folders were kept, he was intercepted by Dan, who had come to collect the reports. He grabbed Michael by the shoulder, his eyes worried but not secretive. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, studying his friend's face carefully. "After yesterday, I spent half the night wondering if you were going to snap." Michael smiled, and it wasn't a forced smile, but almost easy. "Yes, Dan. I'm fine. I called the police myself. It was my choice, and I don't regret it." Dan exhaled, his shoulders relaxed, and he slapped Michael on the arm. "Well done. Damn, you scare me sometimes, but you're well done." That afternoon, a police officer called the same gray-haired officer who had been on the scene the night before. His voice was businesslike, but not cold, as if he saw Michael as more than just a brawler, but a man trying to keep his cool. "Mr. Kowalski, this is Sergeant Miller," he began. "We need to confirm your statement. Can you come to the station today?" Michael agreed, although the thought of talking about yesterday again made him feel a little sick. But he knew he had to finish it, put an end to it. At the station, he told the whole story: how Steve had attacked him, how he had defended himself, how Dan had been a witness. He spoke calmly, looking the officer in the eye, and felt each word loosen his nerves a little. When he mentioned how Steve had tried to hit him, and then complained about his dislocated arm, the sergeant chuckled and shook his head. "He tried to break my arm," Michael said with a slight smile. "Better that than cutting myself on that glass." Miller smiled back, his eyes warming slightly. "It's good that you told the truth," he said, closing his notebook. "We'll sort this out. Your witness corroborated your version, and that guy's, let's just say his story isn't very convincing. If he files a complaint, we'll call you, but for now everything is clear." Michael nodded, feeling the tension he hadn't even noticed leave his shoulders. He thanked the officer and walked out of the station as the sun was setting. For the first time in months, he wasn't in a hurry. The streets of the city were full of people, some hurrying home, some chatting on the phone, some just standing at a kiosk buying coffee. Their faces were strange, but they didn't make him feel afraid or irritated. They were simply part of the world, which continued to move despite his personal storms. The rain that had been falling all evening had stopped, and the sky had cleared, revealing a deep blue, almost black, on the horizon. Michael paused on the corner, looking up at the clouds, illuminated by the last rays of the sun, and suddenly thought, could this all be real? Not a dream, not a nightmare, but his life, which, despite everything, was continuing. The thought was strange, almost frightening, but there was something liberating about it. He inhaled the cool air, feeling his lungs fill with cleanliness, and walked to his truck, which was parked at the curb. When he got home, he stopped at the mirror in the hallway. His reflection was familiar, but somehow new. There were no stains or tears on his shirt, only slight creases from a long day. His eyes, which had recently sparkled with pain and anger, now looked calm, with a tired but lively sparkle. Michael ran a hand over the stubble on his chin and suddenly realized that for the first time in a long time, he did not see a victim in the mirror. He saw a man who had done all he could and left the rest to fate. The lump of pain in his chest that had accompanied him for months disappeared, dissolved like smoke in the wind, and his heart became lighter, almost weightless. He walked into the living room, where the photographs of him and Linda still sat on the shelf. He hadn't touched them since the day she'd left, but looking at them now, he felt no anger or sadness. They were just snapshots, moments from the past that no longer had power over him. He picked up one of the frames, the one of him and Linda on the beach, hugging and laughing, and placed it carefully in a drawer. He didn't throw it away, didn't break it, just put it away, like an old letter that no longer needed to be read. Michael sat by the window, looking out at the city lights that were coming on one by one, like stars in the night sky. The agreements, the truth, the pain, all that was behind him. A new dawn was ahead, and it no longer seemed dark. It was simply new, full of possibilities that Michael did not yet know but was ready to meet. But this evening was not just about peace and quiet. Michael felt something long forgotten awakening inside him: curiosity, a desire to move forward, not just survive. He pulled out an old notebook he had once kept during his service, where he wrote down thoughts, plans, even poems that he was embarrassed to show to anyone. The last entry was 3 years ago, before returning home. Find yourself. The words, written in his own hand, now seemed prophetic. He picked up a pen and, without thinking too much, wrote, "Start again, one step at a time." The next few days were strangely bright. Michael began to notice little things that had previously passed him by. The smell of fresh bread at the bakery on the way to work, the sound of children laughing in the yard, the way the streetlights reflected in puddles after a rain. He even signed up for a motorcycle repair course, something he had always wanted to try but had put off because he thought he didn't have the time. The classes were held in the evenings in a workshop on the outskirts of town that smelled of oil and metal, and the instructor, an old man with calloused hands, told stories about his travels around the country on an old Harley. Michael listened, twisting his wrench, and felt something new begin to form inside him, not just a hobby, but a sense that he could create, not just destroy. One evening, on his way back from school, he stopped by the river that ran through town. The water was dark, but it reflected the lights of the bridge, and there was something mesmerizing about that reflection. Michael sat down on a bench, lit a cigarette for the first time in a week, and simply looked at the water, listening to it gurgle and bump into the rocks. He suddenly remembered how Linda loved to walk here, how she would stop at the railing and look at the river, as if she could see her future in it. The memory didn't hurt, it just passed through him like a gentle breeze, and he realized that he was ready to let her go. Not to forgive, not to forget, but simply to let go, to move on. Dan noticed these changes when they met again at the bar a week later. "You're different, Mike," he said, looking at his friend with a slight smile. "I don't know what it is, but you're alive. For the first time in who knows how long." Michael shrugged, but didn't deny it. "Maybe I'm just tired of being dead," he said, and there was a slight irony in his voice, but there was truth behind it. They talked about many things: work, Dan's plans for a fishing trip, Michael's idea of renting a motorcycle and going out for a weekend. But underneath the conversation, there was a depth that didn't need to be stated. Dan had been there when Michael had fallen, and now he was there when he began to rise. And that was enough. Time, like sand in an hourglass, passed slowly but inexorably. Michael learned to replan his days, building them like a soldier builds fortifications, methodically, with cautious hope. Mornings began with a smell of freshly brewed tea, which he now preferred to coffee, finding something soothing, almost healing, in its soft taste. He rose with the first rays of the sun, opened the window, letting in the cool air, and did exercises on the balcony, feeling his muscles come alive in the morning chill. Then he went down to the yard, where he fed the stray cats, who now recognized him and ran to meet him, purring and rubbing against his legs. These simple rituals became his anchor, small steps that kept him from falling into the abyss of memory. His mind cleared slowly, drop by drop, as if someone was carefully washing away the darkness of the past months. Each new day was like a blossoming bud, still fragile, but full of life. Michael noticed it in small ways, in the way he began to read the newspapers in the elevator, catching the headlines of local news, in the way he smiled at the elderly neighbor who always greeted him as she left the building, in the way his steps on the sidewalk became firmer, more confident. He was not the old Michael, the one who had returned from the war, or the one who had made plans with Linda, but he was beginning to recognize a new him, a man learning to live anew, without looking back at the shadows of the past. One evening, as he was driving home from work, he noticed his neighbor, Bill, the same veteran whose motorcycle he had once borrowed in a fit of desperation. Bill was sitting on a bench by the entrance, hunched over, a cigarette in his hand that was smoldering, but he was not inhaling. His face was gray, his eyes dull, and Michael knew immediately that something was wrong. He knew that Bill had recently lost his job, the warehouse where he worked as a mechanic had closed, and the debts were snowballing. Michael stopped the car, parked it on the side of the road, and, without giving himself time to change his mind, walked over to the bench. "Hey, Bill," he said, sitting down next to her. "How are you?" Bill looked up, a mixture of surprise and weariness flashing in his eyes. "I'm alive," he answered shortly, finally taking a drag. The smoke escaped his mouth, dissolving in the evening air. "And you look better than before." Michael nodded, feeling the corners of his lips lift involuntarily. "I'm trying," he said. "Listen, I have an idea about how to get out." Bill frowned, his brows knitting together, but he didn't interrupt. Michael began to speak, slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if he were afraid to scare away the spark of hope he saw in his neighbor's eyes. He told of the odd jobs his friends had taken after the service, repairing motorcycles, delivering parts, even temporary contracts on construction sites. He mentioned the shop where he had recently begun an apprenticeship and a man named Carl who was looking for help. "It's not millions," Michael said, looking at Bill, "but it's a start. If you want, I can talk to Carl. He's a normal guy, a veteran like us. He'll understand." Bill was silent, looking at the smoldering cigarette butt in his hand. Then he nodded slowly, and something like gratitude flickered in his eyes. "I didn't expect that," he said quietly. Thank you, Mike. I'll think about it." Michael clapped him on the shoulder, feeling the warmth of the simple gesture spread through his chest. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about the past. He just wanted to help, because he knew what it was like to have the world fall apart and see no way out. They sat for a moment longer, watching the sunset paint the sky crimson and gold, and Michael felt that this moment the conversation with Bill, the quiet of the evening, the feeling that he could be useful was another step forward. The night before a business trip to another warehouse in a nearby town, Michael sat in his room, looking at an old photograph he had found in a box of his belongings. It was a picture from Hawaii taken when he was 10, a gray sand beach, himself, skinny and tanned, with a wide smile, and his father standing next to him, fishing rod in hand. The sea in the background whispered its secrets, and Michael suddenly remembered his father telling him, "Life is like waves, son. Sometimes they hit you in the face, but you just keep going." The words had seemed like words then, but now they sounded like prophecy. He placed his hand on the frame of the photograph, feeling the roughness of the wood beneath his fingers, and for a moment he believed that all his ordeals were over. He was alive again, not just existing, but living, and the feeling was new, fragile, but real. The next morning, Michael packed a backpack for the trip, a change of t-shirts, a phone charger, a notebook in which he sometimes jotted down his thoughts. The trip was short 3 days in a nearby town to help with inventory at a warehouse, but he looked forward to it with unexpected excitement. It was a chance to break out of his routine, to see something new, to feel like he was not just part of a routine, but a person moving forward. He climbed into his truck, threw his backpack in the passenger seat, and pulled out onto the highway as the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon. The drive was long, but Michael didn't turn on the radio. Instead, he listened to the wind against the windows and the hum of the engine, which was like an old friend, always reliable, always there. The landscape outside the window changed. City streets gave way to fields where the grass swayed in the wind, and then to forests where the trees stood like silent sentinels. Michael watched them, and his thoughts flowed freely, without pain, without looking back to the past. He thought about Bill, how he might find a job and start over. He thought about the shop, the smell of oil and the clanking of tools, how his hands were learning to make something new. And to his surprise, he thought about the future, not with anxiety, but with curiosity. The air in the city he arrived in was different, sharp and salty, because the sea was only a few miles away. Michael checked into a motel on the outskirts that smelled of cheap soap and bleach, but the room was clean and the bed was surprisingly comfortable. That evening, after work at the warehouse, he decided to take a walk instead of sitting in his room and flipping through the channels on TV. The streets were narrow and cracked, but full of life. Children riding bikes, old people sitting on their porches, and music wafting from the open windows of cafes. Michael went into one, ordered a sandwich and tea, and sat by the window, watching the people pass by. At the next table sat a woman, about his age, with short dark hair and a slight smile that appeared when she read a book. Michael did not notice her at first, but something about her calm caught his attention. She was not like Linda in looks or manner, and that, oddly, reassured him. He was not looking for a replacement, not looking for anything, but her presence, her quiet confidence, reminded him that life might not be all about pain. He did not speak to her, did not approach her, but simply watched her turn the pages and felt something new begin to form within him. Not love, not passion, just an interest in a world that could still surprise. The next day at the warehouse, he met a guy named Raoul, young but seasoned, with an anchor tattooed on his forearm. Raoul was talkative, with a slight accent, and told stories about his life on ships, about storms, about nights under the stars. Michael listened, occasionally asking questions, and felt these stories fill the emptiness in his soul. They worked together, sorting boxes, and Raoul, noticing that Michael was not the type to talk, invited him to have a beer at a local bar after his shift. "You don't look like the guys around here," Raoul said as they sat at the bar, each holding a cold beer. "Your eyes are. Like someone who's seen too much." Michael smiled, shaking his head. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm learning to look in a new way." Raoul nodded, as if he understood more than Michael had said. They talked about the sea, about motorcycles, about Raoul's dream of opening his own workshop. Michael talked about the courses, about Carl, about how he himself was beginning to find pleasure in working with his hands. It wasn't the kind of conversation that would change your life, but it was alive, real, and Michael felt his world expanding, becoming more than just pain and memories. Back at the motel, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, and suddenly realized he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The trip had been short, but it had given him more than just a break from the routine. It had given him the feeling that he could be part of the world, not just a shadow gliding along its edge. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Look ahead, live." Then he closed it, turned off the light, and fell asleep, without nightmares for the first time in a long time. Michael woke to a sound that at first seemed like part of a dream, the low hum of an airplane cutting through the sky somewhere over a vast ocean. He opened his eyes, not yet sure where he was, and lay there for a few seconds, staring at the wooden ceiling, cracked like a map of distant lands. Then it dawned on him: Hawaii. He was here, in a place that had once seemed like the end of the world to him as a child, where the sea whispered fairy tales and the sun warmed him as if it wanted to embrace him. But now he had come here not as a child, full of delight, but as a man whose life had been rewritten by pain, loss, and a slow but stubborn return to himself. The trip to Hawaii was unexpected. The warehouse where he worked had won a contract to supply parts to a local port, and Michael was asked to accompany the cargo, check documents, and help set up equipment. He agreed without hesitation, sensing that this trip was more than just a job, but something more, a calling he couldn't explain but didn't want to resist. Deep down, he knew that returning to the islands where he spent his childhood would not be just a business trip, but a meeting with himself, who he was and who he could become. The plane landed at Honolulu Airport in the early afternoon, when the sky was already beginning to darken and the air was thick with the smell of salt and flowers. Michael picked up a rented SUV, old, with faded paint and creaking doors, but reliable as an old friend. He followed the directions of the GPS and soon found himself on a narrow road leading to a small town by the ocean, where a motel was waiting. The town was sleepy, almost frozen in time. One-story houses with colored shutters, palm trees nodding in the wind, and the occasional passerby who moved with the lazy grace of people who knew there was no place for haste. The streets smelled of the sea and fried fish, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the laughter of children playing on the beach. Michael checked into a motel, where he was greeted by an older woman with a smile as warm as the sun. The room was simple: a bed with a faded coverlet, a small table by the window, a fan spinning lazily under the ceiling. But when the rain began to fall that night, pounding the tiled roof, Michael felt a peace he had not known in a long time. The sound, rhythmic, almost musical, was like a lullaby, soothing his wounded soul. He lay down on the bed without turning on the light, listening to the raindrops dance on the roof, the wind whispering something outside the window, and for the first time in months, he slept without nightmares, without the shadows of the past haunting him in his dreams. Early in the morning, he awoke to silence. The rain had stopped, and the world outside the window was fresh, as if reborn. Michael put on a light shirt, shorts, and old sneakers, feeling almost like a boy running to the sea for the first time. He left the motel and headed for the beach, which was only a few minutes' walk away. The sand under his feet was soft, still cool from the night, and the water was clear as glass, with light reflections of the sun playing on the surface. The sky overhead was an iridescent dome where blue flowed into gold, and somewhere in the distance, on the horizon, clouds were gathering like flakes of cotton wool. The waves touched the shore softly, leaving behind foam that immediately dissolved, like memories that no longer held captive. There was a light breeze in the air, carrying with it the smell of salt, and somewhere on the edge of hearing, an old melody, like the sound of a flute, perhaps played by someone in the house next door. Michael stopped at the water's edge, feeling the sand hug his bare feet. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes, and the salty air filled his lungs, as if washing away the remnants of pain that still lurked in the corners of his soul. At that moment, he remembered his childhood, the day when he first felt free. He was 10, running along this same beach, laughing and falling into the sand, and his father looked at him with a smile, holding a fishing rod in his hands. The world had been simple then, full of wonders, and Michael suddenly realized that a part of that boy still lived in him, despite the war, the betrayal, the years of loss. The thought was like light breaking through the cracks in an old wall, and he smiled, for the first time in a long time, without bitterness. Not far from him, at the surf line, a boy of about 7 was playing in the sand, building a castle with turrets that were immediately destroyed by the onslaught of the waves. An old man in a straw hat sat next to him, his face cut with wrinkles like a map of a long life. He was telling the boy a story. Michael did not hear the words, but he saw how the child looked at the old man, enchanted, his eyes shining with delight. The scene was so simple, so vivid, that Michael felt a prick in his chest, not pain, but something warm, almost forgotten. He found a board washed up on the shore nearby, polished smooth by the sea, and sat on it, watching the boy and the old man. In their world, there was no place for betrayal, for pain, and Michael suddenly wondered, what did he expect from life after everything he had been through? The sun rose higher, painting the horizon in a golden light that reflected off the water like molten gold. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the warmth touch his face, the breeze caressing his skin. The silence around him was louder than any words he had ever heard. It did not demand answers, did not ask questions, but simply was like the sea, like the sky, like himself. In that moment, he realized that the past was no longer a chain. It no longer held him, and did not pull him back like an anchor clinging to the bottom. It was part of his story, but not his whole story. He straightened his shoulders, feeling the tension drain from his body, and stepped closer to the water, letting the waves touch his feet. The cold of the water was alive, real, and Michael laughed quietly, almost to himself. but this laugh was free. He spent most of the day on the beach, in no hurry to get back to business. Work at the docks would start tomorrow, and today he just wanted to be not a soldier, not a husband, not a victim, but just a man looking out at the sea and feeling alive. He wandered the shore, collecting shells that reminded him of his childhood, when he would put them in jars and dream of being a pirate. He ate fried fish at a small beachside diner where the owner, an old man with a shark tattoo on his arm, told stories of storms and sunken ships. Michael listened, smiled, asked questions, and each conversation was a small bridge connecting him to a world he was rediscovering. That evening, he returned to the motel, but he didn't stay in the room. Instead, he took a jeep and drove along the coast, to where the road ended at the cliffs, and the sea crashed against the rocks with such force that the spray rose into the air like white birds. He stopped, turned off the engine, and simply watched the sun set, leaving a streak of scarlet light behind it. In that moment, he felt ready for a new chapter, not one where he fought the past, but one where he built a future. Not without pain, not without scars, but with a hope that was stronger than everything he had lost. The next day, work began. The port was noisy, full of life. The cries of seagulls, the hoots of ships, the smell of diesel and salt. Michael checked boxes of spare parts, signed documents, talked to the local mechanics, who turned out to be surprisingly friendly. One of them, a guy named Keo, with long hair pulled back into a ponytail, offered to show him the island after work. Michael agreed, and that evening they drove to the north coast, where the waves were higher and the beaches were wild, almost untouched. Keo talked about his family, about how his grandfather taught him to fish, about the legends of the island, where the spirits of the sea protect those who respect them. Michael listened, feeling these stories weaving into his own, making it richer, deeper. "You don't look like a tourist," Keo said as they sat by the fire they'd built on the beach. "You have the eyes of someone who's known a storm. But you're here, and you're smiling. That's strength." Michael looked at the fire, feeling the warmth touch his face. "I'm learning," he said quietly, "learning to be stronger than my storms." Keo nodded, as if he understood everything Michael hadn't said. They sat late into the night, looking at the stars, which were so bright they seemed closer than home. Michael felt that this place, this island, this moment, was not just an accident. This was his chance to start over, not to forget the past, but not to let it define the future. The trip ended after 3 days, but Michael decided to stay for another week, taking a vacation. He wandered the island, climbing mountains where the air was fresh and the views were breathtaking. He swam in the sea, feeling the water embrace him, washing away the last vestiges of pain. He talked to people, fishermen, artists, children, and each conversation was like a small piece of the puzzle that would shape his new life. On the last evening, he returned to the same beach where he had spent the first day. The sea was calm, and the sky was full of stars. Michael sat down on the sand, feeling how it still held the warmth of the day, and took out his notebook. He wrote, "Live, love, be free." Then he closed it, lay on his back, and looked at the stars, listening to the sea whisper its eternal tales. He knew that the trials were not over, but now he was ready for them with an open heart, with faith in himself, with love for life, which, despite everything, continued to be beautiful. Michael returned from Hawaii feeling as if he had left behind not only footprints in the sand on that distant beach, but also the last fragments of his past. The plane landed at the airport in his hometown late at night, and when he stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, saturated with the smell of asphalt and distant smoke, he felt that home was no longer a place of pain, but simply a place where he lived. The morning greeted him with a gray sky, but even the clouds, heavy and low, seemed not to be harbingers of rain, but a soft blanket under which the city was preparing for a new day. Michael walked down the street, and his steps were light, almost weightless, as if he had thrown off an invisible burden from his shoulders that he had been carrying for months. Dan walked alongside him, chatting about his plans for the weekend fishing on the lake, old vinyl he'd found at a flea market, and the beer he was going to brew himself to prove I'm as good as those hipsters. Michael listened, the corners of his lips smiling, and didn't interrupt. His heart was free not from pain, not from anger, but from the need to keep looking back. He looked at Dan, at his animated face, at the way he waved his arms as he talked about how he'd almost drowned his fishing rod last year, and he felt that this moment their conversation, the noise of the city, the smell of wet asphalt was real, alive, his. They went into a small cafe on the embankment, where the river flowed slowly, reflecting the gray sky and the rare glimmers of sun. Inside, it smelled of freshly ground coffee and warm bread, and the windows, fogged up by the morning chill, created a coziness that Michael had not noticed before. He chose a table by the window, from where there was a view of the water, and ordered coffee first black, without sugar as he liked, but today he allowed himself to enjoy this moment, to inhale the aroma, to feel the warmth of the mug in his hands. Dan ordered his usual cappuccino, sprinkling it with sugar with such generosity that the waitress, a young woman with a pierced eyebrow, smiled and shook her head. "So tell me," Dan said, stirring the sugar and looking at Michael with a slight smile. "How did it feel? Hawaii, the sea, the palm trees, it's all cool, of course, but you're different. What happened there?" Michael leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the river. The water was calm, but there was a power to it, as if it knew where it was flowing, even if no one else could see it. He paused, choosing his words, and when he spoke, his voice was even, without the pain that had lingered in his every word. "Calm," he said, and there was a firm, almost tangible confidence in his voice. I don't know how to explain it, Dan. There, on the island, I was just there. Not thinking about the past, not looking for answers. Just looking at the sea, listening to people, breathing. And I realized that I could go on living. Not just existing, but living." Dan nodded, his eyes shining with something that looked like pride. "Damn, Mike," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "You sound like a man who's found something important. I don't know what it is, but it suits you." The light from the lamp above their table outlined Michael's profile, illuminating the scar on his cheekbone, a thin line that was almost gone, but still reminded him of the past. The scar, left over from the war when shrapnel grazed his face, was part of his history, but it no longer defined him. Michael ran his finger along the pattern on the wooden table, as if trying to feel for answers he already knew, but had not yet fully realized. Then he looked up, and there was clarity in his gaze, as if he were seeing a sunrise again, not the one in Hawaii, but the one waiting for him here, in this city, in this life. There was nothing superfluous left in his head, no anger, no longing, no questions he had been searching for answers to for so long. He knew one thing: the path he had taken had been hard, but it had given him the right to live anew, without looking back at the shadows of the past. "I don't want to be who I was," he said quietly, looking at Dan. "The one who came back from the war, or the one who built a life with Linda. I want to be me, whatever I am now." Dan smiled, his face softening. "You're already doing it," he said. "And damn, you're doing it better than I expected." They sat in the cafe for another hour, talking about simple things: Dan's plans for renovating his house, the new motorcycle Michael had his eye on at the shop, how this year's autumn was going to be warm. But underneath all that talk was a depth that didn't require words of friendship that had weathered the storms and was now stronger than ever. When they stepped outside, the river was reflecting the first stars, and Michael breathed in the cool air, feeling it fill his lungs like it washes away the last of the dust from the past. The next few days were filled with new energy. Michael returned to his rituals: morning exercises on the balcony, feeding the cats in the yard, reading the newspaper in the elevator, but now there was more life, more meaning in these actions. He began going to Carl's workshop more often, where the smell of oil and metal became almost familiar to him. Carl, an old man with calloused hands and stories about his motorcycle travels, became for Michael not just a teacher, but a person who reminded him that life is not only a struggle, but also creativity. Together they took apart an old engine, cleaned a carburetor, argued about which bolt held the load better, and Michael felt how his hands, accustomed to the weight of a gun, were learning to create something new, something alive. One day, on his way back from the workshop, he stopped at a small bookshop on the corner. The window was piled high with old books, their covers faded from the sun, but there was something inviting about it. Michael walked inside, smelling the dust and paper, and began leafing through the books, looking for nothing in particular. His eyes fell on a book of poetry by a local poet he had never heard of. He bought it, not knowing why, and that evening, sitting by the window, he began to read. The words were simple but deep as the sea, and Michael suddenly realized that he wanted to write again, not just notes in his notebook, but something more, maybe stories about his life, about the war, about how he learned to get up after falling. He began writing in the evenings, when the city was asleep and the silence was his ally. They weren't masterpieces, but each word was honest, pulled from deep within him. He wrote about Hawaii, about the sea that whispered its secrets to him, about Bill, who now worked in Carl's studio and began to smile more often. He wrote about Linda, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness, as a part of his story that no longer defined him. These writings became his way of speaking to the world, even if the world wasn't listening yet. One Saturday, Michael decided to go out of town, where the river was wider and the woods were more remote. He rented a motorcycle, an old but well-maintained one with a low roar that reminded him of freedom. The road wound through the trees and the wind whipped his face, but Michael only laughed, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He stopped at a small lake where the water was so clear that it reflected every branch, every leaf. He sat down on the grass, took out his notebook, and wrote, "Freedom is not the absence of chains. It is the choice to keep going, even when they still jingle." On the way back, he stopped by Dan, who was tinkering around in his garage, trying to fix an old radio. They drank beer, laughed about Dan nearly burning the wires, and talked about life, not the past, but what lay ahead. Michael told him about his recordings, and Dan, to his surprise, didn't make fun of him. "You have to publish this," he said seriously. "Maybe not now, but someday. People need to know what it's like to get up when everything is falling apart." Michael shrugged, but the thought was in his head. He wasn't ready to share his words with the world, but the idea that his story might help someone was new, exciting. He began to see himself not just as a man who had been betrayed, but as a man who could tell about it, to show that life goes on even when it seems like it's over. A month passed, and Michael noticed that his house had changed. He added new touches, a shelf of books, a few plants that required care but gave a sense of life, a painting of the sea that he bought from a street artist. He began cooking complex meals, experimenting with recipes he found online, and even invited Dan and Bill over for dinner, where they ate pasta with a sauce that, according to Dan, was almost like Italy. They laughed, drank wine, and Michael felt like his house was a home again, not just a place to sleep. One evening, sitting by the window with a mug of tea, Michael looked out at the city, where the lights were coming on one by one like stars. He remembered Hawaii, his father, the sea, and he knew that the boy who had run along the beach was still alive in him. He listened to the noise of the city, which was like distant surf, and he tasted freedom, not the kind that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from choosing to live no matter what. Before him lay a world that had not yet been written blank as a sheet of paper, full of possibilities, and in this world there was no room for deception, only for the truth that he carried in his heart. He took out his notebook and wrote, "Dawn is not just a new day, it is a promise." Then he closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would be a new beginning, and he was ready for it. Thank you for being with me until the end of this story. If you liked it, give it a like, write a few words in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Each of your responses is a powerful boost of inspiration for new stories. See you soon. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.